The envelope sliding across the white tablecloth didn't contain a graduation card. It contained an invoice. My mother, Catherine, pushed it toward me with the cold precision of a surgeon making an initial incision. We were sitting in a glass-walled restaurant in Boston's Seaport District, surrounded by the hum of expensive conversation, but the silence at our table was deafening. I opened the paper. It was an itemized list of my existence. Tuition, housing, food, clothing. At the bottom, in bold font, was the summary, "Zero return on investment." Beside it lay a formal letter of disownment. "We do not support bad assets," she said, sipping her wine without looking at me. "You chose to be a lab rat instead of a doctor. We are cutting our losses." Has anyone else ever felt like their family treated love like a business transaction? Drop a comment with your city and the time you are watching this. I want to know who else is awake and listening. I didn't blink. I didn't gasp. I just stared at the total figure at the bottom of the page. $242,000. A precise calculation of my childhood itemized down to the braces on my teeth and the piano lessons I hated. My mother watched me, her fingers drumming a silent rhythm on the stem of her wine glass, waiting for the breakdown. She wanted the tears. She wanted the scene. She wanted the satisfaction of seeing her quiet, disappointing daughter crumble under the weight of their rejection. But she had miscalculated. She was operating on the assumption that I still carried a balance in our emotional ledger. She didn't realize I had written this relationship off as a bad debt years ago. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out a pen. It wasn't a Mont Blanc or a Waterman, like the ones my father kept on his mahogany desk. It was a cheap plastic ballpoint with the logo of my university's synthetic biology lab faded on the side. I clicked it open. The sound was small, sharp, and final in the hush of the restaurant. There is a concept in business called a sunk cost. It refers to money that has already been spent and cannot be recovered. Rational actors know that you do not throw good money after bad. You cut your losses, you liquidate, you move on. People talk about family like it is a sacred bond, an eternal contract written in blood. But blood is just biology. Relationships are investments. And for the last decade, I had been pouring my energy into a black hole, hoping for a return that never came. I looked at Richard, my father. He was adjusting his silk tie, looking anywhere but at me. He was a man who built his identity on titles: Chief of Surgery Board Member, Donor. To him, I wasn't a person. I was a failed product line. A lab technician wasn't something you bragged about at the country club. My sister Alyssa sat next to him, scrolling on her phone, likely checking the engagement on her latest med school influencer post. She was the golden asset, the high-yield bond. I was the liability. But here's the secret they didn't know. The opposite of love isn't hate. Hate requires energy. Hate implies you still have skin in the game. The opposite of love is indifference. It is looking at the people who raised you and seeing strangers. It is realizing that the pain you used to feel wasn't a wound. It was just the friction of trying to hold on to something that was already gone. I had already mourned them. I had grieved the parents I wanted when I was 12, sleeping on a cot in the lab because it was warmer than my own home. I had grieved them when I won the state science fair and looked out into the audience to see empty seats. I had gone through the bankruptcy of my heart years ago. This piece of paper wasn't a shock, it was just the final paperwork. I signed my name at the bottom of the invoice. Cynthia. Not your daughter, just Cynthia. Thank you, I said. My voice was steady, flat, devoid of any tremor. This makes things very simple. My mother frowned, her brow furrowing. The script wasn't going the way she imagined. Simple, she repeated, her voice sharp. Cynthia, do you understand what this means? You are on your own. No trust fund. No safety net. You are choosing a dead-end path, and we will not subsidize your failure. I understand perfectly, I replied. I pushed the paper back across the table toward her. Received and accepted. I stood up. The chair scraped softly against the floor. I didn't look back at them. I didn't offer a final plea or a dramatic goodbye. I simply walked. I walked past the maitre d', past the table of businessmen discussing stocks, past the valet stand outside. The Boston air hit me like a splash of cold water. It smelled of salt and exhaust and freedom. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with it. For the first time in my life, the silence in my head wasn't lonely. It was clean. I checked my watch. It was 8 p.m. I had 12 hours until graduation. 12 hours until the rest of my life began. And as I hailed a cab watching the city lights blur in the reflection of the window, I felt a strange cold lightness in my chest. They thought they were cutting me off. They had no idea they had just released me. My sister Alyssa is what you would call a high-performance asset. She was the prototype my parents always wanted. When she got into medical school, Richard bought her a white Range Rover with a red bow the size of a beach ball on the hood. She posted a photo of it on Instagram with the caption, "Hard work pays off." She didn't mention that the down payment, the monthly installments, and the insurance were all paid by the bank of Dad. Alyssa is 22, beautiful, and building a personal brand as a med school influencer. She posts study with me videos where she highlights textbooks in aesthetic coffee shops wearing scrubs that have never seen a drop of blood. I remember asking Richard for a loan during my sophomore year. I needed supplies for my thesis project, a specialized enzyme that cost $3,000. He looked at me over the top of his reading glasses, the same look he gave patients who asked stupid questions. "We pay for medical degrees, Cynthia," he said. "We do not pay for technicians. Surgeons cut. Technicians clean up the mess. If you want to play with test tubes, you can pay for it yourself." So I did. I worked the graveyard shift monitoring incubators for the university. I ate vending machine crackers for dinner 3 nights a week. I didn't have a Range Rover. I had a sleeping bag rolled up under my desk in the biolab because it was cheaper than heating my apartment. I spent my 21st birthday alone watching bacteria grow in a petri dish, realizing that the hum of the Sub-Zero freezer was the most consistent comfort I had. For a long time I thought they hated me because I wasn't good enough. I thought if I just discovered something big enough, if I published in a prestigious enough journal, they would finally look at me the way they looked at Alyssa. But tonight, walking into my empty, quiet apartment, I finally understood the mechanism of their cruelty. It wasn't about success. It was about control. There is a psychological concept called a narcissistic injury. It happens when a narcissist feels their self-worth threatened by someone else's autonomy. My parents didn't hate me because I was a failure. They hated me because I was surviving without them. My independence was an insult to their ego. Every time I paid my own rent, every time I fixed my own car, every time I didn't ask them for help, I was silently proving that they weren't necessary. To a parent who views their child as an extension of themselves, independence looks like betrayal. They needed me to be the lab rat, small, dependent, and trapped in a cage they built, so they could feel like the scientists in charge. If I could succeed on my own, it meant their power was an illusion, and they would burn everything down before they admitted they were powerless. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a text from Catherine. "Don't you dare make a scene tomorrow. We are sitting in the VIP donors box. Do not embarrass us." A minute later, a text from Richard. "We expect you to be civil. Smile, take your diploma, and go. No drama." I looked at the messages and felt a cold, dry amusement. They were so afraid of a scene. They were terrified I would cry or scream or throw a tantrum in front of their wealthy friends. They were bracing for a daughter who was hurt. They had no idea they were dealing with a daughter who was finalizing a merger. I didn't reply. I simply turned my phone off, placed it on the counter, and walked to the window to watch the Boston skyline glitter in the dark. They wanted me to be invisible. Fine. I would be invisible. Until the moment I became inevitable. The morning of graduation day was a study in contrasts. Across town, in the master suite of my parents' brownstone, I knew exactly what was happening. Alyssa was likely sitting in a makeup chair, a ring light reflecting in her eyes, filming a Get Ready With Me video for her 50,000 followers. There would be a team of stylists paid for by Richard, ensuring that the future doctor looked perfect for the photos that would inevitably end up on my mother's Facebook wall with a caption about legacy and pride. The air in that house would smell of hairspray and expensive perfume. My morning smelled like espresso and ozone. I was sitting on the 42nd floor of the Vertex building in the Seaport District, looking out at the harbor through glass so thick it silenced the city below. I wasn't wearing a cap and gown yet. I was wearing a tailored navy blazer I had bought yesterday with the last of my savings. Across the mahogany table sat 3 men and 2 women in suits that cost more than my entire undergraduate tuition. They weren't professors. They were the acquisition team for Biovance, one of the largest pharmaceutical conglomerates in the world. On the table between us lay a stack of documents 3 inches thick. They weren't buying a term paper. They were buying neurosynth. During those long nights in the lab, when my father thought I was wasting my time playing with test tubes, I wasn't just running experiments. I was solving a problem that had stumped neurosurgeons for decades. I had developed a synthetic protein scaffold that bridged severed nerve endings, allowing them to regenerate 80% faster than current grafts. It wasn't just a school project, it was the future of trauma surgery. And Biovance knew it. The lead counsel, a woman with silver hair and eyes like flint, slid the final contract toward me. "We have structured the acquisition as discussed," she said, her voice professional and crisp. $12,500,000 upfront, with a 3% royalty on all future applications of the patent. The non-compete clause is standard. You remain on as a consultant for the next 18 months. I picked up the pen. It was heavy-weighted, a stark contrast to the plastic one I had used to sign my disownment papers the night before. My hand didn't shake. I thought about the invoice my mother had given me, $242,000. A rounding error. I was about to make more money in 10 seconds than my father, the renowned surgeon, made in 5 years of cutting people open. I signed. Cynthia. The counsel nodded, took the folder, and tapped a command into her tablet. The wire transfer has been initiated. It should clear within the hour. Welcome to the Biovance family, Cynthia. I stood up and shook their hands. It felt surreal, not because of the magnitude of the moment, but because of the quietness of it. There was no applause, no parents weeping with joy, just the cold, hard verification of value. I walked out of the conference room and into the elevator. As the numbers ticked down, I pulled out my phone. I opened my banking app. The screen refreshed. Balance $12,500,412. I stared at the number. It looked like a phone number. It looked like freedom. My parents had disowned me to save money. They had cut me off to protect their assets. The irony was so sharp I could taste it. I wasn't the liability anymore. I was the bank. I walked out into the lobby, the security guards nodding at me with respect. I hailed a cab to the university. It was time to put on the costume. I had to go sit in a hot auditorium, wear a polyester gown, and listen to speeches about following your dreams while my family sat in the VIP box, dreading the moment my name would be called. They were expecting a daughter who was ashamed. They were expecting a girl who had been put in her place. They had no idea they were about to watch a hostile takeover. The graduation hall smelled of stale air conditioning and cheap bouquet flowers. It was a sea of black polyester caps, a holding pen for thousands of students waiting for their names to be mispronounced. I sat in row 42, seat C. I was surrounded by nervous energy students texting their parents, fixing their tassels, sweating through their dress shirts. But I wasn't looking at the stage. I was looking at the VIP donors box on the mezzanine level. That's where Richard and Catherine were sitting. They looked like royalty holding court in a coliseum. Richard was wearing his charcoal suit, the one he only wore for board meetings and press photos. Catherine was in a cream silk dress that probably cost more than the combined debt of the 3 students sitting to my left. They weren't watching the ceremony, they were networking. I saw Richard shake hands with a university trustee, flashing that practiced charming smile that hid his teeth. Catherine was adjusting Alyssa's sash, ensuring her golden child looked perfect for the live stream. Alyssa had her phone out, ring light attached, broadcasting to her followers. They looked comfortable, they looked secure. They looked like people who had successfully trimmed the fat from their budget by disowning their disappointment of a daughter. They had no idea they were sitting in the crosshairs. The Dean of Sciences walked to the podium. He tapped the microphone. The feedback whined through the speakers, silencing the crowd. Usually this was the part where they read names for 3 hours. But today the script was different. Before we begin the conferral of degrees, the dean said, his voice booming, we have a special announcement. Today marks a historic moment for our university's research department. We are honored to welcome Mr. Elias Thorne, CEO of Biovance Pharmaceuticals. A murmur went through the crowd. Biovance wasn't just a company. In Boston, it was an empire. They owned the labs, the patents, and most importantly, they owned the hospital networks. I watched the VIP box. Richard sat up straighter. He adjusted his tie. Biovance was the parent company of the hospital, where he was chief of surgery. Elias Thorne was effectively his boss's boss's boss. Richard was clapping enthusiastically, probably hoping to catch the CEO's eye, desperate to be seen as a loyal foot soldier. Elias Thorne took the stage. He didn't look like a corporate suit. He looked like a predator who had just eaten. He gripped the lectern. Innovation is rare, Thorne said. True disruption is almost non-existent. But this year, a student from this university solved a problem that has plagued neurosurgery for 20 years. We are proud to announce the acquisition of the proprietary patent for NeuroSynth, a technology that will standardize nerve regeneration protocols globally. I saw Richard lean over to Catherine. I could read his lips. NeuroSynth. That's the new graft. That's huge. He was excited. He was thinking about using the tech. He was thinking about the surgeries he would perform, the papers he would write, the glory he would claim by being an early adopter. He thought he was witnessing the future of his career. This technology was not developed in a corporate lab, Thorne continued. It was developed right here in the late hours by a student who funded her own research. We are proud to announce the inventor and our newest strategic partner, Cynthia. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the polite silence of a ceremony. It was the vacuum of shock. Then the spotlight hit me. I stood up. I didn't smooth my gown. I didn't wave. I just walked toward the stairs. The camera feed on the giant Jumbotron screens shifted from the stage to me. My face, calm and cold, was suddenly 30 feet tall. I walked up the steps to the stage. Thorne met me halfway, shaking my hand with the vigor of an equal. He handed me a symbolic plaque, but I barely felt the weight of it. I turned to face the audience. And then I looked up. I looked directly at the VIP box. The camera followed my gaze. On the giant screen, the feed cut to a close-up of my family. It was a portrait of ruin. Catherine's hand was covering her mouth, her eyes wide, staring at me as if I were a ghost. Alyssa's phone had dropped to her lap, her live stream forgotten. But Richard was the masterpiece. His face had drained of all color. He wasn't just looking at a daughter who had succeeded. He was looking at the person who now owned the intellectual property that his entire surgical practice depended on. He realized in that split second the hierarchy of the world. He was a surgeon. He was a mechanic. I was the architect. He used the tools. I owned them. Biovance owned his hospital. I was Biovance's partner. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I just held his gaze for 3 long seconds, letting the realization settle into his bones. He had disowned me to save money. He had cut me off to protect his status. And now he would have to wake up every morning and go to work in a hospital that paid royalties to the daughter he threw away. I turned back to the crowd, accepted the applause that was finally deafeningly mine, and walked off the stage. I didn't go back to my seat. I kept walking out the side exit into the sunlight. The air tasted sweet. The transaction was complete. I didn't go to the reception. I didn't need to drink warm champagne in a plastic cup or make polite conversation with people who had ignored me for 4 years. I hailed a car and went straight to the airport. I had a meeting in Palo Alto the next morning, and my new life wasn't going to wait for the confetti to settle. But on the flight, staring out at the clouds, I finally dissected the look on my father's face. It wasn't just shock. It was the total collapse of his worldview. You see, Richard and Catherine spent their entire lives investing in the wrong currency. They believed in status. They believed that power came from the title on your office door, the neighborhood you lived in, and the people who recognized you at the gala. They thought they were powerful because they were surgeons. But in the modern economy, they were just high-paid laborers. They traded their time for money. If Richard stopped cutting, the money stopped flowing. He was a servant to his own lifestyle. I had built something different. I had built equity. I owned intellectual property. I didn't just have a job. I owned the machine. There's a concept called the illusion of power in an empty wallet. It's common among the old guard. They have the country club memberships and the leased luxury cars, but they have no leverage. They exist at the mercy of the systems they serve. My parents thought I was a failure because I didn't have their status, but while they were polishing their image, I was building leverage. They realized in that auditorium that the hierarchy had flipped. They were the mechanics. I was the architect. They were the tenants. I was the landlord. The technology I owned would dictate how they did their jobs for the next 20 years. They couldn't ground me. They couldn't cut off my allowance. They couldn't even speak to me without going through my legal team. They had spent 24 years trying to mold me into a trophy they could put on a shelf, never realizing I was the one building the museum. 2 days later, I was standing in the living room of my new penthouse on the 35th floor of a building overlooking the Charles River. I had bought it in cash the same afternoon the wire transfer cleared. It was a fortress of glass and steel, quiet, secure, and completely mine. The air conditioning hummed with a pristine silence that money buys. I wasn't renting anymore. I wasn't sleeping on a cot in the lab. I was home. The fallout from the graduation ceremony had been nuclear. The live stream footage of my parents' faces drained of color, frozen in horror as the announcement was made, had garnered 4 million views in 48 hours. The internet does not forgive narcissists. The comments section was a digital autopsy of their character. Strangers dissected their body language, their arrogant posture, the way they refused to look at me. My father's reputation as the untouchable surgeon was crumbling under the weight of his own hubris. But I wasn't watching the view counts. I was watching the doorman who had just buzzed up a delivery. He brought in a floral arrangement so large it required a dolly. It was a massive explosion of white lilies and orchids arranged in a crystal vase that probably cost more than my first car. It was a centerpiece meant for a gala loud and desperate. I walked over to it. There was a card nestled in the greenery printed on heavy stock with a gold border. I opened it. "Cynthia, darling. We always knew you were special. We are so incredibly proud of our visionary daughter. Let's celebrate this weekend dinner at the club, Love, Dad." I stared at the card. We always knew. The audacity was breathtaking. 48 hours ago, I was a bad asset to be liquidated. Today, I was a visionary daughter. They weren't sending flowers because they loved me. They were sending flowers because they had realized they just threw away a winning lottery ticket. They were trying to hedge their bets. They were trying to rewrite the narrative before the ink dried on the history books. They wanted access. They wanted the association. They wanted to walk into the country club and say, "Yes, the neurosynth inventor, that's our girl." I didn't feel angry. Anger implies that you care about their opinion. I felt the cold, precise satisfaction of a forensic accountant closing a fraudulent file. I walked to my desk. I opened the top drawer and pulled out the cream-colored envelope they had given me at the restaurant. The itemized invoice. $242,000. The cost of my existence. The bill for my childhood. I placed the invoice next to the massive, obscene vase of flowers. The contrast was perfect. The desperate bribe next to the cold receipt. I took my phone out. I snapped a photo. I opened the text thread with Richard. I attached the photo. I didn't write a paragraph. I didn't ask for an apology. I didn't scream about the years of neglect or the nights I spent hungry so I could buy lab reagents. I typed one word. Paid. I hit send. Then I went to the contact settings. I blocked Richard. I blocked Catherine. I blocked Alyssa. I watched the names disappear from my phone one by one. It was like deleting a corrupted line of code. The system wasn't broken anymore. It was optimized. They wanted a transaction. They got one. They wanted a return on investment. I gave them exactly what they asked for. I paid the bill. We were even. And since we were even, the contract was concluded. They had no more equity in my life. They were minority shareholders in a company that had just gone private. I walked to the window. The sun was setting over Boston, painting the harbor in shades of violet and gold. I could see the lights of the hospital where my father worked, tiny and insignificant from this height. He would go there tomorrow and every day, after knowing that the technology saving his patients' lives belonged to the daughter he tried to erase. He would have to live in the world I built. I took a sip of water. The silence in the apartment wasn't empty. It was full. It was full of peace. It was full of potential. It was full of the quiet, unshakable knowledge that I had built my own table, and I didn't have to offer them a seat. I was the lab rat who learned to run the maze better than the scientists, and now I owned the laboratory. If you have ever had to build your own table because they wouldn't give you a seat, share this story. And tell me in the comments what is the one thing you achieved that they said you never would.